thank you so much for coming to the APL this year. It's a lot of work, and we're thrilled to have everyone. So the APL acknowledges that this meeting, held in Banff National Park, is taking place on the traditional lands of Treaty 7 territory, comprised of the Stoney Nakoda nations of Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw, 3 nations of Blackfoot Confederacy, the Piikani, Kainai, and Siksika, and the Tsuut'ina of the Dene people. Treaty 7 is also shared with the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. It is with great respect and gratitude, and in an effort of reconciliation, that we proceed on this path of collective inquiry and learning. In this spirit, I humbly ask Elder Tina Fox, who so graciously came to us today, of the Nakota Nation, to accept this offering of tobacco and open our conference with a prayer.
About this that will try. Ministry of the Hawaii's. They are coaching here only. Have just in when I gave it to her, I just told Amy, I will interpret some of the names they mentioned, like Blackfoot to us if they're Nitsitupa. And then Dene Sarsi, we call them Chantogabin, and the Nakota people, Iiska, and the Cree, Shahia, and the Métis, we refer to them as Tawaichi, those who own themselves, is how we describe people, because we were, after treaties were signed, we were restricted to reserves, whereas the Métis were out there free. So we call them those who own themselves. Okay, I will offer a prayer in my language. I want to thank the organization for the invite to do the opening prayer. And so I will do it. Thankfully, my people, we still have our language. Residential schools try to kill the culture and language through the children. But, and some tribes have totally lost their languages. But those in the Treaty 7 area, many of us still have our languages. And our language, Abi, at Minithni is quite strong still. We still have little kids that speak it. So, you don't have to stand when I pray. An elder said, as First Nations, we don't stand when we pray. We can't stand up in the sweat lodges, he told me. So we sit in a circle. Aktuelli hansi noka. Hai sneeshi nigam snee. Ayu tabit na hawa stelen. Stubium by any jamde. Sneeshi tragi ones. Jigam havne. Opuagin ones ham just at to hanging it chagapin ye jamne. Otanga ones. Opina ones. It's in a data pinjam dash ye can hanchagi jamna. The Hegi Chavichi, the Handa Hibi ones, Nangu, Nahish Hibishi, the Iha Hibichi, the Hando Hangi Rustamana, Labitash, the I Tibichi. So now Jiggy had a coaching. Haven't just a Nawashu by the Bean Chavichi. A bean Jabi in it, Upinagas, Mugabichi. Ni to ni jigiham. Ni to ni jigiham isje hibitat. Ni honenga sudishi. Shabi atuzo. Amen. I said a prayer at the University of Calgary once, and I ended with Amen. And this young man came up to me and he said, when you ended your prayer, you said Amen. I said, yeah, that's so you'll know that the prayer has ended. Thank you.
And now I'd like to invite up onto the stage John Phillips, the president of the APL, to offer some words of welcome and to introduce our first keynote.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a great pleasure to be face to face with so many people after all this time. Some of us are a little in shock that this is actually happening, but here we are, the avant-garde of associations of this kind, meeting face to face for the first time in a long time. So I welcome you all on behalf of the APL. I'm very pleased to see you here, and I'm very thankful, I cannot say how much, to the work that Josh, Toth and Alain Beauclair have put into this at MacEwan University in putting it all together and making such a fine job of it so far. And I also don't want to spend too much time now because I'd like to get straight into the introduction to Dr. Tracey Lindberg. I feel that we're very privileged to have Dr. Lindberg here, and I'm particularly looking forward to her paper. Now, Dr. Lindberg is Professor and Research Chair in Indigenous Laws, Legal Orders and Traditions at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law. She's a citizen of the Assiniboine Nation, or the Kelly Lake Cree Nation. She holds an LLB from the University of Saskatchewan and an LLM from Harvard University and an LLD from the University of Ottawa. There she was awarded the Governor-General's Gold Medal for her dissertation, Critical Indigenous Legal Studies. And particularly interesting to me, her debut novel, Birdie, was a finalist for the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize, as well as CBC Canada Reads finalist and named an OLA Evergreen Award. Birdie, I'm not going to try to summarize this fascinating book, but it deals with the experience of recovering from wounds of the past and is informed clearly by Dr. Lindberg's expertise in the law and the knowledge of Cree traditions. Dr. Lindberg is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada's College of Law Scholars, New Scholars, Artists and Scientists. Her research interests include traditional Indigenous governments, Cree laws, and translation between Canadian and Indigenous laws, Indigenous women, and legal advocacy and activism by and for Indigenous peoples. Her current research and creative interests are engaged in her completion of a documentary, a novel, and a non-fiction text, all of which engage Indigenous legal orders, teachings, and knowledge. So without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Lindberg to come up and present. Thank you.
Tansay, Newaka Maganak, Kiditamska and our Homa, Kitaskiwa Kapay to Gogayan, Egwamina, Nilana Skoba Gujik, Kapiris Kapes Pixquian, hi. What I've said in my language, the Cree language, Nikeu, is thank you to the people originals to this territory. Thank you to the people whose bones have become the soil. Thank you to the land itself. I'm thankful as well for my relatives in the room, and I'm thankful to those who organized and brought me into this space. When I first thought of what to discuss here, I had this, what I thought was an aha moment, but this actually turned out to be an oh no moment. I thought, well, I'm going to tell people how to radicalize through the academy and through literature. And then realized as I was thinking about it and writing about it that it's a radical act to show up. It's a radical act to write. It's a radical act to speak. And that you're here, you've showed up, you've written, you've done the speaking. You're probably already well advanced in some of this discussion. But what I wanted to talk about was the idea of advocacy, because I guess maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I took the term activist off of my bio on social media. And I have to say that looking around the room, I was probably, the last time I was arrested, some of you probably weren't born. So the idea of activism in the current contemporary context, I wanted to talk about it in terms of how I have mellowed and had this conversation happening with a couple of people in my old age. I erased the term activist with an intention and mindfulness, but also with a little bit of embarrassment, because that idea of being arrested and protesting and going to everything. I did that for a very long time in my youth. Now I'm more likely to be the person who sends money over to the Women's Lodge at the pipeline protest. I'm more likely to be the person who shows up and speaks in front of a group of academics. I'm more than likely the person who shows up at our community meetings as head of my family. So my activism and my understanding of grassroots activism have changed, but I would say have not grown very much over the years. I'm thinking specifically of Tristan DeRocher. And Tristan DeRocher is a citizen of Air-Orange, which is Métis territory in what is now known as Saskatchewan. And Tristan, in the summer of 2020, walked 635 kilometers from Air-Orange to Regina, Saskatchewan, and set up a teepee on the edge of the legislative grounds. And while there, Tristan, who walked with a group of people he called Walking with Our Angels, made it clear to every news agency across the borders, anybody who contacted him, that he was there to be an agent for people who didn't have a voice, who were facing horrific levels of suicide within youth within the communities, including within Air-Orange. So 635 kilometers, a group of people, and they go and they set up on the legislature, and the police are there, of course, and other people are showing up to support, other people are showing up to egg on. And Tristan DeRocher fasts for 44 days. He's 19 years old, 44 days, and 44 was the number of MLAs from Saskatchewan who had not supported or they had voted down a suicide prevention bill, which Tristan was advocating for. To me, that's advocacy. That's advocacy and that's activism. That recognition of the relationship that Tristan has with Air-Orange and with the legislature. To me, the land that he stayed on there was his land, was it the land of the original peoples to that territory. But not in that nonsensical sort of generic Indigenous, the earth is our mother world. In a precise way, Tristan and the people that he was working with took responsibility. I think about them being advocates and showing up and the comparative point of being here, and I have to take activist off my profile on Twitter. I know as well that part of this means that the elders that I followed down this road passed through some of this as well. That Tristan someday will be 50 years old and be called an emerging writer or a new scholar. I think that's kind of beautiful to be in your 50th year and to be emerging and new in those ways. But the idea that Tristan showed up sticks with me. That Tristan showed up and showed the relationality that he and his people and the people who passed, who took their own lives, have to the land, was consistent and drawn through it. And I think that that advocacy is something that we share. I also want to point out that during the time that Tristan was, what they would say was protesting, but what Tristan would say is existing on Indigenous lands. During the time that Tristan was on those lands, there was a news article that came out because a judge who had heard about Tristan being there, who was also active on the file, is how they would say it, I think. The judge who was making a determination whether or not Tristan could sit there, or whether or not he'd be taken out by the RCMP. That's who I think the judge was, who heard and listened, but who walked through this space that Tristan was occupying, the place where Tristan was refusing to eat, and welcoming in the spirits into the teepee that he was in and the world that he was in. And I thought about that this judge got negative press because he walked through this place. And I thought that's the real thing. That's the real issue, and that's the heart of what I'm going to be talking about today. The idea that there is a neutrality, that assignment and marriage of Western values is possible without unfairness, and allows for neutrality is one of the powers and benefits of white supremacy. That judge that was able to walk through there, to me, in my mind, showing up and having that conversation or listening to people, touching the land, having a relationship with the land, figuring out what Tristan's relationship was to the other people within the Walking with Our Angels, to me, that's law. That's law school. That's education. And that judge, who was told they were not to advocate, took into account the idea that I think that we're all advocating all the time. It's whether or not we have a normative approach to it, where the society we live in has rendered normal or normative that idea that the judge comes from a place where you can be neutral, and doesn't necessarily abide by the understanding that when you go to law school, you're being indoctrinated in an almost purely capitalist understanding of what law is and who has and who does not have, and the justifiability and rationale for it is provided for you in law school. All of that, when a judge shows up in the community and says, what's really going on here? To me, that's at the point where a person is becoming an advocate. Imagining that the judge does not already have a commitment to Indigenous peoples as a relation, to land as a relative, is also one means by which white supremacy leaches into and becomes part of common sense. I've spent, while the introduction is quite accurate in terms of where I've been up until about 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I started working at the University of Victoria, and they have the world's first JD. It's a Juris Indigenous doctorate, where we work with Indigenous communities, Indigenous citizens, and we try to develop a skill set of thinking and talking about Indigenous laws and legal orders by people who commonly would study at a law school. Mostly within this cohort of people, which is 24 people a year from around the world, 12 of them would be non-Indigenous, 12 would be Indigenous generally. We just graduated the first group of them this past term. But that idea of actively pursuing Indigenous knowledge in spaces and in ways that allow for advocacy lives heavily within me. And I want to talk to you about a couple of examples that we've had in conversations in the law school and stuff that I'm writing about now. In addition to the work that was held out in the introduction for me, I'm also writing a book right now with George Littlechild. And George Littlechild, for those who don't know, is also Cree. He does beautiful artwork, beautiful mosaic. They look like painted glass or stained glass. They're so incredible. And I'm tying stories and legal stories to some of the pieces that he's written. One of the things that was brought to us as a challenge is one of the elders that I work with. I said, I want to call this book, I want to write about love. And I said, everybody writes about hurt and everybody writes about pain. I want to write about love and the way that we feel about each other and the way that love crosses lines, gender, humanity, animal, mineral, spirit, in our stories. I want to talk about that. And the elder said, well, that's great. She's a Cree elder. And she said, but you know, there is no Cree word for love. And I thought about that, and I thought, that can't be true. That can't be it. And then I realized that I had to stand back and start to parse not just the language, the understanding of what that might mean in a particular context, but I had to stand back and start to think about romantic love as differentiated from hereditary love. Love amongst a, within a comic book or movie scenario, and love for the land, being in love with the land, being in love with water, being in love with trees, being in love. So in that discussion, in that context, I've been learning so much from the students that I work with and from the people that I'm writing with, that I wanted to be able to bring it in here to talk about what advocacy looks like in the everyday, from that place of both law, literature, and Indigenous law. So maybe 2 examples I'll start with before I introduce the topic. The first is in that conversation about Roe and Wade, which is coming up again in the United States, and which should bring ideas, thoughts, feelings to all of us. I think that as a person who studied in the United States and who studied Roe and Wade at an American law school, that we've kind of formulated our response to it outside of law school in the general conversation into 2 camps. And there's people who believe women have autonomy over their bodies, and also, that's the way I frame it, that's not the way that it necessarily is in the world, and also, there's another opinion. So I'm going to tell you this from this space and this understanding, how it was that I came to understand and feel about advocating for things that I didn't fully understand. I'd always understood this conversation about abortion to be a conversation about a woman's right to choose, and have passionate engagement with it as a person who never necessarily wanted to have children, but knew very strong women my whole life. I've been raised by generations of tough, mouthy Cree women. And as the discussion came up again about Roe and Wade, I started thinking, has anybody ever just sat back and thought, and stood there for a minute, what are the relationships? Think of the responsibilities and obligations of people to laws in the places that they're on. That is, whatever state, Texas, I'll get to that in a minute, where Roe and Wade came from, whatever state it came from, rather than positioning it as one of those 2 camps, had anybody thought to think what the Indigenous people from that state, the town within which the people were having an active argument, what their law was with respect to women's rights? The normalization of the dialogue at a level of here and there, binary, whatever, but not including Indigenous knowledge, including Indigenous peoples. To me, that's what we have to advocate for. We have to continue to advocate for the inclusion of, the representation of, the positionality of Indigenous peoples. If we're not Indigenous peoples and we're in the room, we need to make different rooms. We need to ask Indigenous people if they want rooms. We need to be able to have a group of Indigenous peoples to inform us about this. One time I talked to an elder from a Cree tradition about the right to choose. And the elder said to me, this was a man for what it's worth, but he said to me, the Creator gave that child to the woman, so you don't have a right to choose. And I thought about that and its implications. To me, that idea that you have no choice as a woman, really difficult, really upsetting. And I think you can imagine the sort of way that I would respond to that. It's in that moment, and in those moments when ideas are held as fact, that I'm attempting to be kindly to my relationship, to my people, my family, to my land, and to do it so I can advocate with accuracy and authenticity. As upset as I was, as upset as I get, I owe it to them to be as fair and as open in my thinking and learning, to acknowledge the reality of the colonial disruption of legal philosophies and principles. I owe it to them as well to let stand as a possible truth, with all the discomfort, upset, and dissonance that resonates and creates and brings into the room. I owe it to them to question, engage, and critique kindly in order that I did not form or perpetuate some sort of fundamentalism, passing as Indigenous knowledge, because I was too afraid to be critical of my own people, our past, too afraid to be engaged or to be an activist. Advocacy requires me respect and humility, yes. It also requires that I acknowledge the truth that Indigenous legal philosophies and knowledge exist and can sometimes become tainted by colonial experience and interpretation. With that group of 24 students that we're working with every year, we walk into situations where we go and work with communities and bring forward community legal agendas and bring forward community legal histories. And some of the students have a heartfelt passion for advocacy, and they show up and they're all in. And they believe everything they're told. And we've said to everybody, go in there with the same rationality and the same logic and the same fierce critique that you have in other places. Just know that you have an obligation to learn those traditions of critique and kindness from that place as well, and to implement and give that accord. The idea that I had no right to choose in my head, my brain rejects it, but I send it through this possible truth tree that ends up in front of those students who are working in a framing of Canadian law, who are taking in Indigenous legal orders. And I say to them, my elder told me that there is no right to choose. And having people situate themselves around that, not as a position, not as a righteous belief, or not as a right or a wrong, but you can have a righteous belief. You can think something is rightful. But being able to understand that and advocate, even if it's not your belief or feeling, is part of the hard learning curve that many of them have engaged in. And that idea that both things can exist, women as agents and autonomous, and the creator as decision maker, coming to a certain peace with that is my problem. That I have had given to me by this beautiful elder, one who said there is no love. I have to figure out where love exists and how it exists with land, people, things, places. And with the other elder, who gave me the idea to think about agency without choice, which is still troubling and perplexing to me to this day. But it requires me to think as an advocate about agency in the realm of the authority of Indigenous laws and legal orders. I had to understand, as radical as it seemed, that the law of the land might not be pro-choice or anti-anything. Kindness in this instance, advocacy in this instance, may mean creating, saving, and providing space for beliefs, understanding truths, facts, which are not your own. So they may be Kickapoo, Alabama Cushata, or Isleta del Sur Puebla laws that are in place there. But I want us to normally and ordinarily go to that. Whose laws are these? Whose land is this? I have a friend named Sophie who is now 16. When Sophie was 5 years old, she was in Vancouver. Her mom's, her sister, and another family were in Stanley Park. And Sophie turned to the family and said, because she lived in Ontario, lives in Ontario, I live on Anishinabe's territory. Whose territory is this? 5 years old when she said that. She had normalized the idea that we should find out whose territory we're on every time we go there. She had normalized the idea that there are relationships that she might not understand when she's on that territory, but that she would take responsibility for it. And she's asking other people, what's your relationship to this land? That, to me, is radical advocacy and is kind advocacy. The refusal to erase commitment to include Indigenous logics is a part of radical advocacy. In Cree territory, I know we have and had birth control. We have herbs to control, prevent, and terminate pregnancy. And entire societies, midwives, little mothers, committed to welcoming and raising a child, walking out a child. We had and have herbs that prevent and interrupt childbirth. It's not either or as indicated in that, as I call it, binary perpetuated by Roe and Wade. It's about what does this law as tied to place and people provide? And to be able to answer that as an advocate, you have to do a deep search into people in place and what that and those people look like. It sounds and often feels ridiculous to do it, but being critical means that we have to look beyond the parameters of right and wrong and sometimes look to righteous and rightful. And for me, the biggest struggle I have in terms of advocacy now is how do I provide advocacy in the space of conflict and dissent? How do I do this now in a place where actively people are engaged in arguments about land, territoriality, who owns, claims, pipelines, missing and murdered women, disappeared and killed children? How do we have conversations about relationality when our relations have not been historically honored? I started to think about this in the stuff that I became, in the last 2 years, which have been hard years for everyone. I became guardian to 2 kids from our family, and I've never had children before. That's a conscious choice. Some of us choose celibacy, some of us have it thrust upon us. I chose not to have children, but I have these gorgeous kids who come to me now, and they're at a difficult age, and they came from a difficult background. And I started to think when I was writing this in earnest, what is it that I would want them to know? And I'm going to teach you like I would teach them the ideas or the principles of what I think that advocacy looks like. We use words like reconciliation. One of my elders says, we're not going back to a place we've already been, we've never been there. So let's call it conciliation at the most. That idea of what does it look like to pull these things together and be an advocate in a place like this, in a room with great minds in it here. It's the same as at my kitchen table. And so at my kitchen table, the thing that we say to the kids, and I learned this from my late mentor, Elder Cardinal. It's simple. The first step that I would say in this is show up. Show up and keep your word. One time when I was sick and living in Ottawa, he told me to come home and come to ceremony, and he took me out to Musqueam. And at Musqueam, they doctored me in the lodge and took care of me, and then sent me back to law school. That's part of the sort of relational understanding, but the thing that struck me from that whole moment was that my late friend said to me, if you tell him you're going to show up, you show up. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. When you talk to that medicine man, if you're going to go there, you show up. You don't hold out any promises. You're as good as your word is embedded in me, but it's not a thing that he said to me. I think of that today because showing up is often hard. I think of that today because the late Harold Cardinal kept his word to me and to himself in a million ways and lived a life of integrity and respectful engagement in many ways. I think of that from that Indigenous spot, and then I think about what's it like to listen to that as an Indigenous or non-Indigenous person in the audience. And I want to give you an example from my life that explains showing up and the importance of showing up. In the work that I've done, I've lived in Cree communities. I've never lived in my own community. I've lived in Cree communities not my own. I've lived there in all 4 seasons because if I was going to do legal work for them, Dr. Cardinal told me you need to have a relationship with that land and you need to see it in all 4 seasons. So I did it. This is after I got back from law school and Harvard Law School. I actually began my legal education by living on Cree territory and trying to understand my relationship to Cree lands. We went to ceremony really frequently. In my head, I've rewritten it, and I think that we went every day. It wasn't. It was probably 4 times a week though, and that felt like every day. If you go to sweat, you know what I'm talking about. It's work, and it's a lot of work in the community. It's a lot of work specifically for the medicine people and for the traditionalists who do it. For those of us who go in, it's work for us because we're infants in our understanding of what tolerance of heat can be, amongst other things. But while I was there, every day that we went, there would be somebody there who had relocated to the community by virtue of being a member of the Mennonite Central Committee, a Mennonite family who moved into community and lived there for 4 to 6 years. And when they were there for 4 to 6 years, they did various things, but I couldn't get a job description. I didn't know what it was. But in that sweat lodge that I went to 3 to 4 times a week, the head of the family was there in the lodge each time. And I didn't think I understood it. I think I thought it was weird. You know, as a Cree person coming to a Cree ceremony, and there's this Mennonite person who knows the ceremony better than I do, and who's there every night and went there before me and will go there after me. I thought, that's really odd. This is until about a couple of months in, and at one point the community was bereft of their very few firekeepers, men to hold the rocks, men to lift the rocks, men to keep the fire going. At the time, seasonally or economically, or culturally, whatever was going on in the community, there were very few people to do that. And on one night, when this happened, the head of the family from the Mennonite Central Committee was invited to lift the rocks. And you take the rocks in on a pitchfork, and they're heavy and they're hot, and it's work. And you do it over 4 rounds, and you load them in, and it costs you. And I thought about that, and I think about that in terms of advocacy. Him showing up every night for that ceremony in order to be able to lift the rocks. To me, that's what advocacy is. You might not believe in that spirituality. You don't have to subscribe to that philosophy, and there's humility in that relationship, but there's a responsibility to just show up. And in just showing up, showing a commitment to the community, showing a commitment and a respect to the ceremony, and also the capacity to step outside of the idea of where you come from. So that one idea that it's as humble as showing up and carrying rocks. In the work that I do now with law students, I think about that. I try to think about, we're building something beautiful, and our goal is to carry the rocks. We might not own the pitchfork, we might not know the land that we're on, but we can show up and carry the rocks when given direction. That one thing for me has been mind-blowing, to stand back and teach to my nephews as they come to community with me now and say, we're going to show up. What are we going to do there? I'm not quite sure yet. Probably anything. This past summer, when they were first with me, we took them to a ceremony in our community, which took place in our traditional territory, which is part of what is now known as Jasper National Park. And I took my nephews there, and I just gave them over to the male leadership, and my nephews showed up and put up a sweat lodge and took down a sweat lodge. They never attended one before. The idea that they learned the principles there, to me, was so fundamentally moving that I wanted to keep it on paper someplace so somebody would know it. I wanted it to be someplace in the world so people would understand that regardless of where you come from, Mennonite Central Committee, coming from Pennsylvania, or if you come from a Northern Cree community but have never lived in your Cree community, that idea of advocacy and showing up can change everything for you. The other thing that I learned from another woman teacher, another elder, was that the whole you has to show up. I was at a negotiating table between a Cree Nation and the Government of Canada 20 years ago. I was arrested before that, 20 years ago. And as I was sitting at the table, I had just come back from Harvard University. I had just moved back into our traditional territory. And one elder took me aside and said, you just went to Harvard University. They think you know everything. Pretend you know everything. Just be that. And I hadn't even thought, I hadn't even engaged with the idea of just be that person who is the expert in the room because they think you're the expert in the room. So that's one elder. Another elder took me aside and said to me, you need to be there. And I said, I don't get what you mean. She said, I was 350 pounds at the time. And she said to me, you're a big woman. You take up that whole table. You take up all the space that you want because you need to be all there. And to me, that's what showing up is. That's the whole of you shows up. And the whole of you that shows up queer, non-binary, 1/72 Cree and 2/3 Blackfoot, the moody you, the beautiful you, you bring that whole person into the conversation. You bring that whole person into the room because the possibility of greater and better relationality, but you also save space for people who can't say it out loud, who aren't allowed to say it out loud, or who've been told that it's not okay to say it out loud. So when I teach this, showing up and bringing the whole you is important. We live with that, and I think that it's a nice principle to abide by, but it also is a nice way to engage with the idea of being radically advocating for whatever it is, for me, for Cree peoples, for women, for children. The other thing that I say to people, Sophie, who is telling us at 5 years old whose territory she's on and wants to know whose territory you're on, she's really looking to see what your relationship to the land is and what she's looking to understand. Sophie also read the report of the Royal Commission in French and English, if you've seen it, when she was 13. She's amazing. But she wanted to know and wants to know and encourages us to know the obligations that she has to territory, the obligations that she has to territoriality, the obligations that she has to people. So the next thing that I explain to students when I'm working with them or learning with them and to my nephews is that we have to know. We have to know the laws and the responsibilities and the obligations. What are your obligations and responsibilities to this territory and its peoples? Sylvia McAdam-Wasfaham, a Cree citizen who lives in what is now known as Treaty 6 territory. Sylvia has written a book. Within the book, she talks about when we used to go, back in the day, when we used to go into people's territory, we'd take a bundle of sticks and leave it there, then walk away. And then if we came back in the morning and the sticks had been taken, we had permission to go there. And I think about that when we do land acknowledgements at the beginning of these things, I think those sticks are kind of like that. That when we are talking and offering reverence to the Stoney Nakoda, when we're talking and offering reverence to the Blackfoot Confederacy, to the Métis as well, in our piece, we are bringing forward the understanding that we have an obligation. Those sticks, we understand we have an obligation. Reading a land acknowledgement that your organization drafted tells me about your organization's perception of its relationship to place and peoples. A land acknowledgement by you tells me about your commitment to Indigenous legal orders, Indigenous legal obligations, and Indigenous peoples. I think about this in terms of land acknowledgements begins a conversation about situating ourselves in relation to the original peoples and the territory that we're on. When I travel anywhere, and when you travel anywhere too, I imagine, I ask, whose territory is this? And try to find out as much as I can before I get there, try to learn as much as I can while I'm there, and try to figure out what my responsibility is as a person who's come there. That idea of knowing, to me, the knowledge of your relationship to land, your obligation, means that we are less likely to engage in notional or actual extractivist techniques, notional or actual extractivist understandings, and that we're not doing land acknowledgements as performance or performative or for optics. We're doing it because we are looking for a greater source of relationship with the peoples who are from that territory. We do it because we want to know what our responsibility and obligation is to that land personally. Sometimes I skip pages of notes. So while land acknowledgement does indeed acknowledge the land, what it should do is acknowledge our relationship and relationships to it. When Sylvia McAdam-Wasfaham talks about that bundle of sticks, she's talking about the night that you leave them there, you've left your land acknowledgement. When you come back and it's gone, that's when you start to live your relationship with the land and your obligation to the land and the people whose territory that you're on. How you conduct yourself, how you acknowledge the rights, how you acknowledge the righteousness, how you acknowledge the families, the laws, the language that are there. That's the everyday. That's the work that we're doing. And it's not advocacy work, it's human love, it's family love, it's relational love. And learning that, how to learn, know, live, and do land acknowledgements is a process that allows us to start with. I'm going to say this publicly once, and then I'm going to move on. I'm going to read the one from the University of Saskatchewan when I speak up, and then I'm going to talk to the one that comes from me. Then I'm going to talk to the one that comes from our family. Now I'm going to talk to you about the obligations that I have to this land and this territory and this space. That idea, to me, is so beautiful because I think that that judge in Regina who's walking through the territory was doing exactly that. starting the journey to engage with what you know and to acknowledge what you don't know is the best part of relationality, is the most significant step that you can take at the beginning of it. The next step that I would talk to my nephews about, and that I learn with students that I'm working with and learning from, is that we have to understand relativity. We have to understand relationality. And some of those preconceived notions or constructed ideas we have about who we are and where we come from. Part of the advocacy that we do is being modest enough or humble enough to say, I don't get it, I don't know it, and I'm not a part of it, and I'm somewhat oppressive for that reason. It's hard and it's embarrassing. I've moved to Wasanich territories in what is now Vancouver Island, on what people call the peninsula of the island. And as a person who's lived in Cree territories for a lot of my life, not necessarily my own, who has a relationship with Cree peoples and Cree lands, moving to that territory and being able to afford property, buy property, rent property, while the peoples original to the territory perhaps cannot, potential for violence, awful dissonance between cultures, all of it. But that idea of Gerald Stanley, I think about that understanding relativity. What does the world look like when you understand that your relatives have had a hard time, are in a space that you share because they're needful? What does that look like? How do we reframe and have that conversation in ways that are needful? What stories do we start to tell when we uproot white supremacy, when we don't have it as the normative background to that conversation? I think about it, and I think about my friends who attended the trial to be able to support Colton's family and his mom, Debbie Baptiste, showing up, and at the end of the day, a sort of relay of white trucks with presumably farmers circling all of the Indigenous peoples who were standing at the courthouse. That implicit threat of, we have this truck, we have this land. What would it mean if we were actually looking at each other as relatives? What would it mean if that idea that Colton Bushy had a relationship to and responsibility to that land, if that was honored? If Gerald Stanley knew the relationship that more than he, but his family and his ancestors had with Indigenous peoples, and made steps before the relationship soured to become well, to become family, to become healed. That's the sort of responsibility that I think we're talking about when we're talking about advocacy and change. If we knew Colton's relationship with that land and honored it, then advocacy means more than standing up and arguing. It means repatriation of place, repatriation of people, repatriation of hope and culture, giving things back, commitment to the principles, philosophy, and law of the land. For me, advocacy in that case has meant that I've written in my book with George a piece on Colton Bushy, and I write it as though Colton Bushy is living his life on his land as a firekeeper. And I tell the story through that lens of violence that enters into his life. And I say this publicly with difficulty because the part of me that knows what relationality means, that I can't put that sort of thing into the world until I actually have okay from the Bushy family. I have okay from Debbie Baptiste. And so for me to publicly admit that I wrote this without having that conversation is to let you know that I have failed, but that I will do so publicly because I want you to know it's okay to fail and fail publicly, but also that you can make things right. And in my making things right, I'm asking the Bushy family if it's okay to have this story out into the world. And if they say it's not, then it'll just be the best thing I never written. Kind advocacy means that I ask the family for permission to publish. The last thing that I tell people to do when you're trying to figure out how to advocate for, by, with Indigenous peoples, that part of it is that we have to live, I say critical kindness or kindly critical lives. And part of this reminds me of many, many stories. When I'm here and I think about this space and this land, I think about how we're told we're not supposed to say the name of our big brother, our big hairy brother. We wouldn't say it in our language, but out in the world, there's even stories down here called Sasquatch everything. The stories that I had growing up told us not to talk about it, not to observe, not to look at, not to play with, because that's disrespectful, and also because there's a story behind it. I've also been told that there are certain stories that we can't tell, certain laws that we can't hear until the first flake of snow falls. And when that snow melts, you can't tell those stories anymore. I've also been told there are stories and laws that you learn when the frogs first start cooking. And then those stories, when you hear that, you can start to tell those stories and tell them until it gets cold again and you don't hear the frogs. That's a space just like our elder big hairy brother, just like not telling a story, not saying the name of we have another brother, older brother we call him. We don't say his name during certain parts of the year. Whether I have disbelief or not is irrelevant to the conversation. I'm a critical person who has to think about when they tell us that that we have to wear skirts to ceremony. Has that been informed by a colonial understanding of femininity and womanhood? Would our women have worn the skirts before? I have to be creative, I have to be critical, but I also have to be kind, because there are people who are going to maintain and say, you need to wear this skirt whenever you go to ceremony. You need not to say this name. You need not to look up at that big hairy human, more than human. Part of the critical kindness and the kindly critical thing that I've had to do is to start to understand my relationship with the fantastic. And from origin stories and places and pieces that we come to even if it feels ridiculous, acknowledging your relationship with it is important, and acknowledging and setting a space aside for it as someone's truth, if not your own, is an important part of that. Critical advocacy means creating and allowing possibility that you might be wrong. When I fasted for the first time, I was ill entirely. We fast for 4 days and 4 nights. And I was physically sick. And on the second day, the person who was hosting the fast came and said to me, there's word that you're really sick. I can take you out. Like, I can take you out of here if you're that sick. You're not allowed to talk during the whole thing, but she said you could talk during this. And I said to her, I don't get the point of being here and just throwing up and defecating and spoiling. Like, I don't get how this is a godly fasting experience. Like, what is that? And the elder said to me, Tracey, who told you that this was prayer and that shitting was not? And I think of that all the time. First, because it's shocking, but also because it's true. Who told me that this was the way that it would be, that I'd sit there primly and have this beautiful sort of moment? That part of it was that in being kindly critical, she was letting me know that some stuff is awful, some stuff is gross, some stuff is funny, but the expectation that things go in a certain way, we have to be critical of ourselves, so that I was never critical about that. Another lesson that I take from Elder Maria Campbell in that idea of advocacy is that in her time, in her explanation of the role of us as community members who figure out our relationality, the idea of figuring out why I'm supposed to be in that sweat lodge or why I'm supposed to be in that fast, that we have to take a broader look at it to understand our relationship to relationality, to relativity, but also be kindly critical about that. And it's hard and it's painful and sometimes undignified. And she told me that the first wave of black cars took away the hunters from the land and put them in jail. The second wave took away the children. The third wave took away the children. But the black cars kept coming. The prisons would come and take our people in black cars. She told us very deliberately in 4 waves of it. And then said to me, you're going to law school. Law school is often the black car. When I talk to people about how to be an advocate or why we are advocates, Part of it is that I don't want to ever look back and think that I was driving a black car. That I wrote the paper that allowed people to become, do disservice, be unkind, be ungentle, break the law, break Cree laws, break Indigenous laws, that I provided a springboard for that, then I'm a black car. If those 24 students, if 12 of them go to the government of Canada and try to make claims that Indigenous lands don't exist, that there are no territoriality, that these are just claims, then I am the black car. And social workers can be the black car, and philosophers can be the black car, and writers can be the black car. How is it that you make choices that ensure that you have upheld your family obligations? How is it that you ensure that you're advocating for spaces where people not only feel safe, but where they can say hard and difficult things? I need to be able to create a space in my home, in my classroom, where people can say crappy things. For the past 2 years, I've had the worst experience and best experience teaching of my life. It's been difficult, not just because of COVID. And if anybody who taught online during COVID, who was never ever an online teacher before, you know that keyboard warriors were a thing. And that people didn't really have a responsibility or obligation because they weren't in a classroom with you, didn't have a relationship with you, to act necessarily kind or kind necessarily. And that's part of it, that's part of everybody's experience. But also, in meeting these 24 students, and there's 24 each year, let's say, these waves of students who are studying Indigenous legal theory and Indigenous laws in a law school, half of whom, sort of half, are Indigenous, there is an intellectual righteousness because they've studied and worked with or lived in Indigenous communities their entire lives and they know the right answer and you don't. I've taught in other law schools where I was the expert. I really liked that. It was really nice that I can understand the policing thin blue line where you have that sort of respect where people fall into place, because I had that when I taught at another law school. At this law school, which I came to and I'm still learning and growing with and pained by, I have learned more about pedagogy. I've learned more about my relationship to students. I've learned more about my relationship to land. I've learned more about my obligation to island peoples, to the Wasanich peoples, to the Kwakwakkwak peoples. I learned it all because the students required it of me. They yelled at us and sat us down and said, I don't like the way that we're conducting this circle. I've never ever had to conduct a circle in this way before. I don't like the way that we're having this conversation about women. There are no women in the room right now. How come there are no elders in the room that identify as neither man nor woman? How come, like, very, very aggressive, assertive. And when we came into place in person, said to us, your pedagogy is wrong, your approach is wrong, it's narrow, it's defunct, and we're having a hard time with it. All that during COVID, when I have 2 kids that I never had before, and a dog, which I never had before either. But when my sort of home life was spilling out into a mess, my work life was spilling out into a mess as well, because I was being told, this is not reciprocal, this is not respectful, this is not relational. And they were right. And it was hard and it was grotesque at times, and I probably still have shock after the fact from it. But the idea that they could sit down and say to us, this is hard and this is ugly, but you're not being inclusive, or you're not looking for, or you're being narrow, and you're thinking, who gets to learn that in their 50s, 55, 60s? Who gets to have that conversation with Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous peoples, learners, people actively engaged? There are cheeks in every room. Yes, some of it's not valid, but the idea that you have to step back and figure out your relationship with not just the Indigenous peoples in the room, but the non-Indigenous peoples in the room, the territory that you're on, the territory that you're working with, and you need to know the laws and how to transcribe, not transpose, and translate them and bring them forward to people in ways that are meaningful and useful. Mind-blowing. So we changed everything. We changed the syllabus, we changed the assignments. We kept the communities that we were working with. The communities asked for what they wanted, and as far as that went, the students were completely respectful and responsive. If that's what the communities want, that's what the communities get. But that idea that we had to take it in, not gaslight them, not say this is too difficult to do, we're living in a COVID world and we're talking about a field school, this is too hard. We had to take it in, we had to hold space, make changes, and check in. Living it meant changing our assignments, our pedagogy, our time. It also meant that those students gave me the most beautiful gift, that I was not driving the black car. And until that point, I would have been so if they hadn't stood back and felt like they were related enough to me to have that conversation. That whole person who showed up, that whole person who absorbs the emotional cost, kindly critical and critically kind, to make sure that families, nations, people, and the lands are not absorbing the cost. The students made sure that we did that. And I am living that right now. The other lessons that I learned from field school, from the people in the community, were that the tide waits for no one, which is true, we were late and missed an entire estuary. The tide waits for no one, and also hang your stuff. There's a hook outside of the big house in Wakwaka'wakw traditions. You hang your stuff out there. If you have crap, relational problems, things that don't fit, you leave it outside the house. In the house, you take care of your business seriously. I tell you all this embarrassment because I don't necessarily want people to know that I was a crappy teacher for 2 years, and I don't necessarily want people to know that I've been less than dignified in a fast, but I do it because this past 2 years has taught me that it's important for us to admit that we make mistakes. It's important for us to publicly acknowledge that we're going to screw up, and also to let people know that there are ways to rectify when you screw up. Not every time, not all the time, and don't press your luck, but there will be times and places where you've made a mistake where you're allowed to clean it up. And that's actually the law, that you have to clean it up. So I say this publicly because I want you to hear that. I also do it because this is my idea of lifting rocks. I just show up. It's not my pitchfork, it's not my venue, it's not my idea, it's not my understanding, but I can lift the rocks. These are the rocks that I've lifted for the past 30 years as an advocate. I ask you to think about how it is that you can lift rocks. I ask you to think of how you have lifted rocks in the past. I encourage you to show up. I often, in my early days as a speaker, I would have people say to me, how can I help? And I would say, get out of the way, because I was young and angry. Now when I hear, how can I help? I try to think what kindness requires of me. And kindness requires me to say, show up, learn your relationship with the land, engage with it kindly and critically, and always have a sense of humor about it. Your bottom line coming out of this is not to be a person who's driving or creating the black cars and the obligation to figure out who your relations are. In that exercise to figure out what is critical, what is kind, what is critically kind, you are also going to make mistakes. The biggest lesson that I've had within the last 5 years is that I can apologize when I make mistakes, and I do that quite often and frequently, and also that I have to commit to not making the same ones again and again. So in that lifting of the rocks, I may drop a few hot ones, but I won't drop them each time, and I'll stop doing it over time. The last thing that I want to present to you is in 16-year-old Sophie, who asked everybody whose territory they're on and who read the report and the missing murdered Indigenous women's reports as well in French and English. Sophie has decided that in the work that she's going to do, she's going to be an advocate, she's going to be a lawyer as well. So we went camping one time. I've adopted Sophie and her sister as my nieces. They're not Cree, they're not Anishinaabe, they're not Indigenous, but I teach them as though they are Cree nieces, because that's part of the obligation relationality that I have. So we're going camping one weekend, and we come across this place where there's a graveyard for planes, and I said, Sophie, maybe someday when you're a famous lawyer, you can fly one of those planes. And she said, I'm going to be a human rights lawyer, there's going to be no excess cash for planes. That idea of kindness integrally is built into her. It's an intricate part of whom she is, And I don't expect all of us to have that. We didn't all have those two fantastic moms. We don't all have that experience. But they're a reminder that you don't have to come from that place to be related to that place. You don't have to come from people to be related to people. That you can bring that love, and love is portable. So with that, I thank you for showing up and thank you for listening. And I'm so very humbled to have been here at the end of my COVID journey and the beginning of our opening up to the world, and to be able to speak with you and to you has been a great gift for me. Hi.
I think up there. Yeah, if you're okay with it.
So yeah, we can have questions here. I'm going to turn on the mic. I can hand out mics if who wants to ask a question.
I think it's on. Oh, this one. Yeah.
That's
Turn around.
definitely.
There's a question at the back row as well.
What's this for?
You have the microphone.
Hi, my name is Gertrude. Thank you very much. It will take me a month, probably longer, to digest everything you just said. So I focus on just one point. What you call kind advocacy is very much non-binary, right? How do you translate that into law? Like, no matter which law, it always has to do with prohibition, right? And prohibition is either yes or no. And since you are a lawyer, I'm just curious how you work that part out. Because for me as a philosopher, it's easy to be in favor of non-binary. It's really easy. You can always get around, but not as a lawyer, I think.
I think possibly and practically law schools are teaching you advocacy right or wrong, one party or the other. And I don't know how to necessarily infuse that or confuse that or refuse that. I do think that the idea that Indigenous knowledge, Nihil, Cree knowledge, Shaniha knowledge, Cree knowledge, Shaniha knowledge, allows for space for non-binary is precisely what I'm talking about when I talk about that idea of women don't have the right to choose and the creator makes the rule. That it's neither here, women have the right to choose and creator doesn't make the rule. It's neither here nor there, that you can occupy a space, that we have to find those difficult places. And I think that finding, negotiating, understanding those places where there is shared Venn diagram should be the job of all mediators in law schools. But that we can take some of those lessons specifically from Indigenous thinkers, Indigenous philosophers, Indigenous elders, maybe not Indigenous lawyers because we're indoctrinated too, but that part of it is saying this doesn't work, it is not reflective, and we want the curriculum in the law school to reflect the possibility of more than. But I don't teach business law, and I don't teach contracts, I don't teach property, I teach Indigenous legal theory, Indigenous legal orders, and field schools. So I get to do it for a living. How the law school would do it is in that idea in Canada of reconciliation, talk to the community whose land you're on and ask them what the laws are where they're from and what the binary has to do with them. Thank you.
By accident, this is the second executive committee member speak. We're not going to monopolize everything. It's hard to follow a great question. But I was thinking, when you were speaking about the pro-choice of listening to the elder, I was thinking analogous situations where communities that have been in Nigeria and elsewhere that have been under centuries of oppression and so on, go back and attempt to get rid of colonialism and listen to certain traditions. And then it's about whose voices speak, right? So thinking in Nigeria, for example, it's usually men who decided that these were our certain traditions, and it took later scholars, almost into the millennium, to go back and say, no, there's no that way or something. And traditions are always contested, right? Whether we're on this and or any other. And how do you negotiate that? Because part of what I was thinking with Garrett's question too is like, we all know too well that you can listen, but at a certain point, there's a woman who needs to get on with her life with a pregnancy. And there are people who are going to want to dictate what that is. And that is a choice. And you can't listen for 10 months on that one, right? So how do you negotiate traditions that are, going to be, the question. Thanks. Thank you so much. It was a great talk. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Part of it is, I can't do this with a 9-month time frame no matter what. Let's start there. I can't do anything within 9 months, really. But the idea that Indigenous knowledges, theories, principles, practices, philosophies, laws stay the same all through time, that's not true. Some of the laws are forever laws, and some of the stuff is unchanging. There's some principles and understandings that are not to be messed with, is what I hear. But I've tried to start to think of, in that conversation about Roe and Wade, when thinking about choice, then if I'm looking for what I would call precedents, I'm looking to precedents where my auntie took an herb and terminated a pregnancy. I'm looking for precedents where somebody breastfed their child until the child was 6 or 7 in order not to have other children. I think that in time and in place, those understandings may not change, but their applicability and the precedents that are generated from them absolutely change. And I think we're not good at that. I think that we, all people, are not really good at allowing the space for Indigenous practices, ideas, theologies, philosophies to change and shape. I've often said to people that self-determination means the right to be wrong. Problematic and true, part of it is, but that we have to be able to create the understanding that some of the stuff is going to be the first time we run into some of the stuff, and some of it we will have touched before. So I've talked about reproduction, and I've talked about adoption as a precedent that we could look at, where we had adopted kids from Blackfoot traditions who came to live with us and who came to become and live as Cree peoples, where we've adopted people's spouses who are non-Indigenous and they come in the community and they've become a part of the community. That there's a internationality that's part of that, but also the part of the precedent we can take from that is that people do decide what their citizenship is. It isn't just born in you, it isn't just inculcated, it isn't just inherency tradition. That part of it is learned and taught and changed and exchanged over time. So what I'm trying to do in the work that I do, in the thinking that I do, is follow very closely, if you follow Dr. Val Napoleon, who also is at the University of Victoria, Val talks about taking the legal principles out, putting them down, culturally informed, are situational, and also can be used to police. That I think that interrelatedness, reciprocity, kindness, respect, all those, or healing, all of those words can be used as a bat to reform or to change or to push down and shun. The idea that ethically we engage with the land as if it has a personality, as if it is more than human, more than a person. To me, how do you treat that land to uphold its dignity in a way that's meaningful to it is a harder question than how do I treat you and uphold your dignity in a way that's meaningful to you, because we don't speak that language anymore. If we engage in the fantastic, the land is telling us obviously what is possible, what is dignified, what is acceptable, and what is not. And also we have lots and lots of stories and traditions of our people listening to, learning from, engaged with relations with the land, that we can pull some of those precedents from and start to apply in a modern day context. Part of it is the commodification of the land, the commodification of nature, the commodification of, that old phrase, the earth is our mother. I always tell people, you know, you have to look askance a little bit at that because it's not, you know, it's been used so much that it doesn't have as much meaning as it should. But the idea that you could have a relationship with nature that is as important, which is as caregiving, which is responsible and obliged as it is to a human relation, to me that's dignity, that's dignified. And we have to be able to approach that, renewing that relationship, not just with Indigenous peoples, with everybody, that we recognize that there is life and spirit and intent and obligation, responsibility as a relation is a huge step that I think we have to make. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much for your talk today. It's really interesting. I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us or tell me a little more about how you're thinking about love in terms of its role in your work. You mentioned a little bit in terms of this book that you're working on, and it is a kind of fundamental force. Part of what I'm interested in this is that I think that it's an incredibly complex kind of concept. Right? So sometimes it's directed romantically, other times towards family, towards friends. You can love abstract objects, or you can love like non-person things. It has emotional components and non-emotional components. So it seems to me it's a kind of very rich concept for writing and for using. And I would just be interested in hearing more about how you think about it and have been thinking about it and how you're using it.
So the title of the book is in Cree, and the Cree word for love, which I don't pronounce very well. And the sort of introduction to the book is the discussion with that elder that we don't have a Cree word for love. That's not the same thing. That piece is there. What I've tried to do within the work, when I went to George and said, hey, you know, you've got this beautiful artwork and you've got a collection. I'd like to be able to look through your collection and generate a piece. Like, let's talk about what that can be. He said, how about if we write about horses? And I said, I don't really know much about horses. Like, I don't know very much the piece or what that would look like. And I said, how about we talk about love? And he said, I'm tired of love. And I said, but just wait, George. I said, what if we talk about love grounded in a Cree place, but we're actually talking about love as a continuum and love as a spectrum. One of the stories is called The Woman Who Loved a Crow. Footnote. She more than loved that crow. That's part of the storytelling, that you can have emotional and sexual relations with a crow is a part of it. Trying to understand, if you read Tanya Tagak's book, where earth beings have relationships with spiritual beings, non-spiritual beings, sexual relationships, and otherwise, that continuum and flow is a part of a discussion in many different communities. And I think that I'm trying to tap into the possibility and potentiality of, I'm interested in hard love, people who are difficult to love, places that are difficult to find beautiful. Part of it is because the elder that taught me, Maria Campbell, has taught us the lesson that somebody came up to her one time and said, she worked with inner city kids, and one of the kids said to her, oh, I want to go up north, I want to go up to land, I want to go where it's healthy, I want to go beyond the land. And she said, well, you're on land here, right? And he said, yeah, but the land up there is clean. And she said, what are we telling kids who live in the city about cleanliness and their ability to be clean and their ability to be, if we're just telling them that you have to go out there notionally to the place where land is clean? So I'm trying to look at cityscapes and sewage systems as sacred places and places worthy of love. I'm trying to look at crows and other beasts as animals that are worthy of relationships, relational love as well. I'm trying to, as a person who was brought up believing and understanding in a continuum of love and orientation, I'm trying to write about that from a 50-year-old's place, and to talk about that in ways that will allow people of my generation a vocabulary for it, but also people not of my generation to be able to see themselves within older stories. So a couple of the pieces I'm telling them notionally as legends, but what they really are is like the title is A Documented History of Pan, Indigeneity and Pansexuality within the community. Like it has all of the implications and ramifications of what loving along a continuum or a spectrum can mean. So not just human, not just gendered, not just earthly bound. I'm trying to find spaces for people to enunciate it. And the hard love, people who are difficult to love. There's one piece that I write, how is it that you love the person who brought sexual abuse to your community? How do hurt people, and how do loving people love hurt people? Like hard and painful conversations, I'm trying to figure that out, because in the discussions that we have with community members, that I have with law students, the biggest gift that they have given me is the requirement that we have difficult conversations. And it's hard. I've been avoidant my whole life. I don't want to fight. I don't want to engage. But for the past 2 years, I've had to every day engage in hard conversations about why would we say we can't drink alcohol when we go to field schools? Why would we say that we can't engage in, why is it that we have a moral code that we have to follow when we participate in a field school? Why can't the community 100% commit to and tell us what they're, all of that? And I've had to stand in several different places with lots of people and figure out what right is. And sometimes there just isn't. There just isn't a space for that. So to be able to put it through that critical kindness filter, I think that you could call it the love filter if you wanted to. Like it's a loving act to be inquisitive and to question and to require substantiation sometimes. It's a loving act to require people to be safe when they come into a space. And some of that's hard. So that's what I'm reading about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe just one more?
Yeah.
Hi. Because you mentioned a lot about the relationality to men, I was just wondering, how can we imagine them beyond or in a way that resists property rights regime? Because that is such a dominant way of understanding relationship to men. Thank you so much.
Can you say that again, please?
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, how can we imagine men beyond or in a way that resists property rights regime? Because I feel like that is such a dominant way of understanding men.
Okay, thank you. And as a person who bought property on Vancouver Island, it's hard for me to envision it naturally. The idea of understanding it beyond property, to me, starts to take the form of that same necessity of finding the obligation and the relationship that you have to that land. I'm on this land, it's Wasatch People's land, and they live on the borders of this place. And I have an obligation to them. So part of my obligation is figuring out, do I take a field school there and we figure out how to build something reciprocal that flows back into the community, what that reciprocity is. It's a small answer, and I think about the stuff that other Indigenous peoples are doing across the world. Dr. Wilson is building tiny houses on behalf of and with Indigenous peoples so they have a place. And I think that maybe part of what you're talking about is distinguishing between home and property. That we have to have some difficult conversations about what home is, where home is, and what property is and our investment in it. That part of the commodification and selling of our relative, the earth, the propertization of a relative, we have to start to normalize that conversation and write about it, talk about it, ask questions about it in person, ask questions about it in papers. There's a couple of pieces that are older that I read from the United States that talk about the propertization of whiteness and the way that we're able to assign value to race, the way that we're able to assign value within that context, to me, is the same sort of objectification that we've done with land and assigning it a value based upon our perceptions of what those are. So in that conceptualization, for me, the only way that we can have sort of a kickstart conversation is start to think of land not as property, but as a relative with whom we have a legal obligation to, or a familial obligation to. If the land is our mother, how do you treat your mother with respect, dignity? But that's at the end of several other really great questions too. At the end of talking for an hour and a half. So I wish I had more time to think about it. I hope I see you during the week and we can talk about it. Thank you.
Can we get just one last one?
Sure.
Yes, thank you for your talk. My name is Trent Phillips. He is my mother. I just wanted to, when you were answering that question, I was thinking about Earth and the Indigenous worldview. And the Indigenous worldview is that everything is interrelated. We view Earth as a living creature. As you just said, we view her as mother. And so, I think as the only species that are exploiting Earth to what will be ultimately our demise, I think we need to start thinking about not just property rights, but the fact that how we treat Mother Earth, this living creature, will define the human race. And I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you. Thank you for your talk.
Well, thank you so much, Tracey. I know you're ill and you really gutted it out. So sincerely, thank you for showing up. Really appreciate it.
I'm sorry.
So, quick announcement, we have 2 bars open. There's one in the conservatory through these doors, just to reduce lineups, and then there's going to be another one over there. We'll have some food available for the evening, so everybody enjoy themselves. Thank you.